The morning of June 6, 1944, brought more than just the Allied invasion fleet to Normandy's shores. It brought something the German Wehrmacht had never experienced before, something that would haunt their soldiers from the beaches of France to the ruins of Berlin. As Obergefreiter Hans Müller crouched in his concrete bunker overlooking Omaha Beach, he heard a sound that would define his nightmares for whatever remained of his life: the distinctive whistle of American artillery shells arcing through the dawn sky, followed by explosions that seemed to merge into one endless roar of destruction. What made American artillery fire uniquely terrifying to German soldiers was not merely its destructive power, though that was formidable enough. German forces had faced Russian artillery barrages on the Eastern Front that turned entire landscapes into moonscapes. They had endured British bombardments that demonstrated centuries of military precision. But American artillery fire possessed something different, something that broke the spirit even of hardened veterans. It never seemed to stop. The United States had transformed artillery warfare from an art into an industrial process, and German soldiers found themselves on the receiving end of America's greatest military strength: its capacity for overwhelming material production and logistical efficiency. The superiority of American artillery tactics began with the Fire Direction Center system, an innovation that revolutionized battlefield coordination. While German artillery units operated with relative independence, often requiring lengthy calculations and communications to coordinate fire missions, American forward observers could call down devastating barrages within minutes. Lieutenant Werner Schmidt, a German artillery officer captured near St. Lo in July 1944, later told his interrogators that American artillery responses were unbelievably fast, faster than anything we could achieve. According to military historian John C. McManus in his comprehensive work on the European theater, this speed advantage often meant the difference between suppressing an enemy position and allowing it to dig in or escape. German soldiers developed a particular dread of what they called the American shower, the time-on-target technique that brought shells from multiple batteries to impact simultaneously. Traditional artillery barrages arrived sequentially, giving defenders precious seconds to seek cover between salvos. American TOT barrages eliminated this window entirely. Forward observer Lieutenant James Callahan described the technique's impact in his memoir, noting that during operations in the Hurtgen forest, German positions would simply cease to exist when taut fire was properly employed. The psychological effect was devastating. German troops never knew when the ground beneath them would suddenly erupt without warning, without the usual sequence of ranging shots that preceded conventional barrages. The scale of American artillery deployment shocked German commanders who had grown accustomed to ammunition shortages and rationed fire missions. By late 1944, American forces in Europe could call upon virtually unlimited ammunition supplies. A single American infantry division possessed more artillery pieces than some entire German corps. This disparity only widened as the war progressed, and German production collapsed under Allied bombing, while American factories operated at full capacity, protected by two vast oceans from enemy interference. The technological sophistication behind American artillery supremacy began long before shells flew over European battlefields. In the decades preceding World War II, American military theorists had quietly revolutionized artillery science, transforming it from an approximate discipline into something approaching mathematical certainty. This transformation would prove decisive when American forces finally engaged German veterans who had conquered most of Europe. The variable time proximity fuse represented perhaps the single most feared innovation in the American artillery arsenal. Developed in utmost secrecy and referred to simply as the VT fuse to disguise its function, this device turned conventional high-explosive shells into something far more lethal. Traditional artillery shells either detonated on impact or used timed fuses that exploded at predetermined intervals after firing. Both methods had significant limitations. Impact fuses were useless against troops in foxholes or trenches, while timed fuses required accurate range estimation and often malfunctioned. The VT fuse solved these problems through electronic wizardry that seemed like science fiction to soldiers of that era. A tiny radio transmitter in the fuse sent out signals as the shell descended. When these signals bounced back from the ground, or from any solid object, with sufficient strength, The shell exploded 20 to 30 feet above the target. This airburst effect scattered shrapnel horizontally across a wide area, making foxholes and trenches death traps rather than sanctuaries. German soldiers who survived VT fuse barrages spoke of them with particular horror. Gefreiter Paul Hartmann, who endured 3 days of American artillery fire during the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, told Allied investigators that his unit lost more men in those 3 days than in 6 months of Russian front combat. According to documentation preserved in the U.S. Army Center of Military History Archives, American artillery units in Europe fired approximately 400 million pounds of ammunition per month during peak operational periods in 1944 and 1945. This figure becomes even more staggering when compared to German artillery expenditure. By late 1944, many German artillery units received ammunition rations that would have been exhausted by a single American division in just days. Wehrmacht officers planning defensive operations had to factor American artillery superiority into every calculation, often determining that positions which would have been defensible against Soviet or British forces were simply indefensible against American firepower. The American advantage extended beyond mere quantity to encompass the entire logistical chain supporting artillery operations. German forces in the field constantly struggled with fuel shortages that limited mobility and ammunition scarcity that forced commanders to husband their fire support. American units faced no such constraints. The famous Red Ball Express and other supply operations ensured that ammunition flowed forward in seemingly endless convoys. When American infantry requested fire support, they received it without questions about ammunition conservation or whether the target justified expenditure of scarce shells. German military doctrine had always emphasized maneuver and tactical flexibility as means of offsetting material disadvantages. Throughout the war's early years, superbly trained German forces had consistently outfought numerically superior opponents through superior tactics and leadership. Against American artillery, these advantages meant little. Superior tactics could not prevent shells from falling. Battlefield leadership could not shield soldiers from airbursts that scattered lethal shrapnel across entire grid squares. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber commanded a reinforced company of the 352nd Infantry Division defending a sector near Aachen in October 1944. His detailed diary, recovered after the war and now housed in the German Military Archive in Freiburg, provides haunting insight into what German soldiers experienced under sustained American artillery fire. On October 12, 1944, Weber wrote, "The American guns have been firing for 16 hours without pause. We cannot distinguish individual explosions anymore. It is simply continuous thunder. 3 of my men have gone mad and had to be restrained. 2 others deserted under cover of the bombardment, preferring to take their chances in American captivity rather than endure another hour of this hell." The psychological toll of American artillery fire manifested in ways that surprised German medical personnel. Doctors treating combat casualties noticed that soldiers evacuated from American sectors displayed different trauma patterns than those from Soviet or British fronts. The endless, unpredictable nature of American fire missions created a state of perpetual anxiety that broke soldiers who had previously demonstrated exceptional courage. Unlike the Eastern Front, where artillery barrages were often predictable preludes to infantry assaults, American artillery fire came at all hours for any reason, or sometimes it seemed to exhausted German defenders for no reason at all. This perception was not entirely inaccurate. American tactical doctrine emphasized harassing fire, periodic artillery missions designed purely to prevent enemy rest and recuperation. Throughout the night, American batteries would fire randomly into known or suspected German positions. These missions consumed relatively little ammunition by American standards, but inflicted devastating psychological damage on defenders who could never truly rest, never feel safe, never escape the probability that the next shell might land directly on their position. Captain Robert Miller, an American artillery officer with the 1st Infantry Division, kept detailed logs of his battery's fire missions during the drive from Normandy to Germany. His records show that during a typical 24-hour period in September 1944, his battery of 6 105mm howitzers fired between 800 and 1,200 rounds, and Miller's was just one of dozens of batteries supporting the division's sector. German forces opposing the 1st Infantry Division had perhaps a tenth of that capability, and by September 1944, they often lacked ammunition to fire even that limited allocation. The disparity extended to counter-battery fire, the duel between opposing artillery forces. American sound and flash ranging equipment allowed artillery units to locate German batteries within minutes of their first shots. Combined with forward observer spotter planes that prowled the skies behind German lines, this meant German artillery units operated under constant threat. If they remained in one position after firing, American counter-battery fire would find them. If they adopted shoot-and-scoot tactics, moving immediately after firing, they sacrificed accuracy and reduced their effectiveness to near irrelevance. Lieutenant Gustav Adler commanded a battery of German 105mm guns in Normandy. In testimony provided to American military intelligence after his capture in August 1944, Adler described the impossible situation facing German artillery. "We would fire perhaps 10 rounds, then immediately move position. Before we could set up again, American shells would land where we had been. If we fired from our new position, they found us again within minutes. Eventually we stopped firing except in the most desperate situations. We had guns and we had some ammunition, but we were essentially useless because we could not fire without being destroyed." The town of Hurtgen sat at the center of a forest that would become a killing ground during autumn 1944. German defenders transformed the dense woodlands into a fortress of bunkers, mines, and interlocking defensive positions. When American forces launched their offensive into the Hurtgen forest in September 1944, they confronted some of the most difficult terrain and determined defenders they would face in the entire European campaign. The battle would last until February 1945 and cost both sides dearly. Yet German survivors almost universally identified American artillery as the element that made the battle truly unbearable. Unteroffizier Martin Becker served with the 275th Infantry Division in the Hurtgen Forest. After the war, he provided testimony that appears in Charles B. McDonald's official U.S. Army history of the battle. Becker described how tree bursts, shells exploding in the forest canopy, created cascading effects that multiplied the artillery's lethality. When shells detonated in treetops, they not only scattered their own shrapnel downward, but also created deadly storms of wood splinters and falling trees that killed and maimed with equal efficiency. "We feared the artillery more than infantry combat, more than armor, more than aircraft," Becker stated. "A man can fight against infantry, can hide from tanks, can shelter from planes. Against artillery that explodes above you in the trees, there is nothing to do but pray and wait to see if you survive." The medical consequences of sustained artillery exposure went beyond immediate casualties. German military medical records from late 1944 and early 1945 document epidemic levels of what was then called war neurosis, and would today be recognized as combat stress reaction or post-traumatic stress disorder. Units rotated out of American sectors required significantly longer rest periods before returning to combat effectiveness, compared to units rotated from other fronts. Some soldiers became so psychologically damaged that they could never return to combat duty at all. The Allied bombing campaign against German cities had already exposed millions of German civilians to the psychological effects of sustained bombardment. Many German soldiers had experienced these bombing raids during home leave. Yet veterans consistently reported that artillery fire on the front lines affected them more severely than air raids in cities. The explanation lay partly in the sustained personal nature of artillery fire. Bombing raids, however terrifying, eventually ended. The bombers flew away. Artillery fire persisted hour after hour, day after day, with no respite. Additionally, soldiers in defensive positions could not seek deep shelters as urban civilians could. They had to remain in their fighting positions, relatively exposed, ready to repel attacks that might come during or immediately after artillery preparation. American artillery also proved decisive in breaking up German counterattacks and offensive operations. During the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, launched in December 1944, American artillery played a crucial role in containing and ultimately defeating the assault. Despite achieving tactical surprise and making significant initial gains, German forces found their offensive momentum repeatedly broken by massed American artillery fire. The elite 1st SS Panzer Division, spearhead of the German offensive, covered ground measured in miles during the first days of the attack. But as American artillery resources concentrated against them, their advance slowed and finally stopped entirely. Oberst Heinrich von Luttwitz commanded a panzer regiment during the Ardennes offensive. His after-action report, captured by Allied forces when the offensive collapsed, identified American artillery as the primary factor preventing a deeper penetration. Von Luttwitz noted that his armor could overcome American infantry positions and even destroy American tanks in favorable engagements. But concentrated artillery fire repeatedly forced his regiment to disperse or halt, preventing the rapid exploitation that German doctrine required for successful offensive operations. Most frustratingly from the German perspective, American artillery observers in light aircraft seemed to appear overhead whenever German forces concentrated for an attack, bringing down devastating fire missions within minutes. The railroad marshalling yard at Mainz represented Germany's desperate attempt to maintain logistical connectivity as the American Third Army approached the Rhine in March 1945. For several days, German engineers worked frantically to repair tracks and move supplies forward to frontline units. Then American artillery observers spotted the activity. Within 2 hours, multiple American artillery battalions had registered on the marshalling yard. The barrage that followed lasted 6 hours and expended more than 15,000 shells. When the fire mission concluded, the marshalling yard had ceased to exist as a functional facility. Every building stood in ruins, every track destroyed, every locomotive and rail car either destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. This incident, documented in the operations records of the 13th Corps Artillery, exemplified the fundamental industrial disparity between American and German war-making capacity by 1945. The United States had transformed itself into what President Franklin Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, achieving production levels that defied pre-war predictions. American factories produced artillery ammunition in quantities that German commanders literally could not believe when they first encountered reports from the front. Many senior Wehrmacht officers initially dismissed frontline accounts of American artillery expenditure as exaggerations or propaganda until they personally witnessed the barrages. According to statistics compiled by the U.S. Army Ordnance Department and preserved in the National Archives, American industry produced over 41 million artillery shells of various calibers in 1944 alone. German production for the same year, hampered by Allied bombing and chronic raw material shortages, reached approximately 12 million shells, and this production had to support both the Eastern and Western fronts, plus anti-aircraft defenses. By 1945, German production had collapsed to a fraction of even these reduced levels, while American production continued to increase. The disparity extended to artillery piece production itself. American factories delivered more than 25,000 artillery pieces of all types to the Army during 1944. These weapons ranged from lightweight 75mm pack howitzers to massive 8-inch guns, but the bulk consisted of reliable, accurate weapons like the 105mm howitzer and 155mm gun. German production, constrained by bombing damage to factories and transportation networks, barely replaced losses. By late 1944, many German artillery units operated at half strength or less, with no prospect of receiving replacement guns. Quality differences compounded these quantitative gaps. American artillery pieces were designed for industrial mass production with interchangeable parts and robust, reliable mechanisms. German weapons, while often technically sophisticated, required more skilled labor to produce and more expertise to maintain. As Germany's pool of skilled workers and technicians dwindled, drafted into combat units or killed in Allied bombing raids, the technical sophistication that had previously been an advantage became a liability. Complex weapons that broke down could not be repaired in field conditions. The ammunition itself reflected different industrial philosophies. American shells were manufactured to tight tolerances that ensured consistency, but not at the expense of production speed. German munitions tended toward tighter tolerances and more complex fusing mechanisms, when production standards could be maintained. As the war progressed and Germany's industrial situation deteriorated, quality control became increasingly erratic. German artillerymen faced the infuriating situation of having limited ammunition that sometimes failed to detonate, or detonated prematurely. American gunners faced no such concerns. Their ammunition was reliable, available in abundance, and backed by a logistical system that could deliver it to the guns regardless of tactical situation. The bridge at Remagen stood intact on March 7, 1945, when lead elements of the American 9th Armored Division approached. German defenders had prepared the bridge for demolition, but a combination of American speed and German demolition failures left the Ludendorff Bridge partially intact. As American forces rushed across the Rhine, German high command frantically assembled forces to eliminate the bridgehead. What followed demonstrated American artillery superiority with stark clarity. For 10 days, while engineers constructed additional crossings, American artillery units concentrated around the Remagen bridgehead, engaged in the most intense defensive fire mission of the Western European campaign. More than 300 American artillery pieces of various calibers established positions supporting the bridgehead. When German forces attacked, attempting to throw the Americans back across the Rhine, they ran directly into killing zones that American forward observers had meticulously mapped and registered. German General Major Mauthausen, tasked with coordinating the counterattacks, later testified that his forces never had a chance. Every approach route was covered by multiple American batteries, Elster explained during post-war interrogation. We would begin an attack, and before we could close with American infantry, their artillery would simply erase entire companies. We lost more men to artillery than to all other causes combined. After 3 days, my unit commanders refused to order further attacks. They knew it was suicide. The Remagen situation showcased how American artillery doctrine had evolved beyond simple fire support into something approaching an independent combat arm. The concept of massed fires, coordinating multiple artillery battalions to engage a single target, gave American commanders the ability to deliver firepower previously requiring multiple divisions' worth of guns. During the Remagen defense, artillery fire direction centers routinely coordinated battalions from different divisions, corps, and even armies into single overwhelming fire missions. German forces had no comparable capability. Their artillery remained organizationally fragmented, with batteries and battalions fighting essentially independent battles. The artillery forward observer system represented another American innovation that multiplied effectiveness far beyond what raw numbers suggested. Young lieutenants and captains, positioned with frontline infantry units and armed with radios, field glasses, and detailed maps, could call down fire from miles away. These forward observers underwent intensive training that taught them not just how to adjust artillery fire, but how to think like artillerymen while operating with infantry units. They understood what their guns could achieve and requested fire missions that exploited artillery capabilities while supporting infantry operations. Lieutenant Thomas Winters served as a forward observer with the 4th Infantry Division throughout the campaign from Normandy to Czechoslovakia. His personal memoir, published in 1998, provides vivid insight into the forward observer's role. Winters described how he learned to recognize German troop concentrations, to anticipate enemy movements, and to request fire missions that would arrive exactly when and where they would inflict maximum disruption. We thought of ourselves as the eyes of the artillery, Winters wrote. The guns were the fist, but we directed where that fist would strike. A good forward observer was worth an entire battery in terms of effective damage to the enemy. German soldiers quickly learned to target American forward observers, recognizing them as deadly threats. But replacing killed or wounded forward observers was straightforward for American forces. The training pipeline produced a steady stream of qualified officers, and the radio equipment they needed was rugged and reliable. German attempts to develop comparable systems foundered on equipment shortages and the simple fact that their artillery units lacked the ammunition to support responsive fire missions even when forward observers identified targets. Winter wind swept across the Siegfried Line fortifications in January 1945 as elements of the American First Army prepared to breach Germany's last western defensive barrier. The West Wall, as Germans called it, represented years of construction effort, dense networks of bunkers, dragon's teeth obstacles, minefields, and interconnected defensive positions. German propaganda had assured the population that these fortifications were impregnable. American artillery would demonstrate otherwise. The preparatory bombardment that preceded the assault on the Siegfried line defenses near Aachen fired over 50,000 shells in the first 6 hours alone. American artillery doctrine called for systematic destruction of fortified positions, and the guns executed that mission with industrial thoroughness. Bunkers designed to withstand direct hits from tank guns and conventional artillery shells crumbled under sustained bombardment from 155mm guns and 8-inch howitzers. German defenders who survived the initial bombardment emerged from their positions to find entire landscapes transformed. Obstacles had been buried, minefields detonated by the bombardment's overpressure, communication trenches collapsed. Gefreiter Wilhelm Kessler defended a bunker complex in the Siegfried Line's southern sector. He surrendered after 3 days of bombardment that killed most of his unit and left the survivors incapable of effective resistance. In testimony provided to American intelligence officers, Kessler described the experience. "We had believed our positions were strong, that we could hold against any attack. The artillery fire destroyed that belief. Shell after shell struck around us, on us, near us. The noise alone was unbearable. Men screamed and could not hear their own voices over the explosions. When the American infantry finally came, we were grateful. Anything was better than another hour under the guns." The psychological breaking point that Kessler described had become increasingly common among German forces by early 1945. Units that would have fought tenaciously against infantry assaults or armored attacks surrendered readily once exposed to sustained American artillery fire. German commanders recognized this problem but could do little to address it. Traditional military training and discipline could prepare soldiers to face many battlefield stresses, but the sheer weight and persistence of American artillery fire exceeded what training could overcome. Medical evacuations from the Western Front reflected this reality. By February 1945, psychiatric casualties, soldiers evacuated due to psychological collapse rather than physical wounds, constituted more than 15% of all German casualties in American sectors. This figure compared to approximately 8% in sectors facing British and Canadian forces, and 10% on the Eastern Front, despite the generally more intense combat there. American artillery fire had become not just a tactical challenge, but an existential threat that broke soldiers' will to continue fighting. The refugee crisis flowing back from the Western Front brought news of American artillery superiority to German civilians and rear area military units. Soldiers recovering from wounds told stories of artillery barrages that lasted days without pause, of American forward observers who seemed omniscient in their ability to find and target German positions, of ammunition expenditure that suggested infinite American resources. These accounts, spreading through German society by word of mouth, contributed to growing recognition that the war was truly lost, that Germany faced an enemy it could not hope to match in material terms. German propaganda attempted to counter these accounts by emphasizing German tactical skill and the righteousness of defense of the fatherland. But soldiers who had experienced American artillery fire knew the propaganda was hollow. No amount of tactical skill could overcome shells falling from the sky by the thousands. No ideological commitment could make bunkers more resistant to high explosives or protect soldiers from airburst shrapnel. Berlin's outskirts echoed with artillery fire in April 1945, but these guns belonged to Soviet forces conducting their final offensive against the Nazi capital. American artillery in the Western Theater had completed its mission. From the beaches of Normandy to the Elbe River, American guns had fired millions of shells, supported countless infantry advances, broken dozens of German counterattacks, and reduced fortified positions that might have held for months under conventional assault. When Wehrmacht forces finally surrendered in May 1945, ending the European War, captured German officers consistently identified American artillery as the weapon they had feared most. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, who signed Germany's unconditional surrender, told Allied interrogators that German forces might have held out longer if they had possessed comparable artillery resources. "We understood that your industrial capacity exceeded ours," Jodl stated. "But seeing that capacity translated into artillery fire that never stopped, that came from everywhere that we could not effectively counter. That was the moment we knew the war could not be won." The statistics compiled after the war's conclusion confirmed what German soldiers had experienced viscerally on the battlefield. American forces in Europe had fired approximately 400 million artillery shells during the campaign from June 1944 through May 1945. This expenditure averaged roughly 900,000 shells per day across the entire campaign. By contrast, German artillery on the Western Front fired perhaps 30 million shells during the same period. A roughly 13-to-1 disadvantage that only worsened as the war progressed and German production collapsed entirely. The human cost of this artillery disparity appeared in casualty statistics. Analysis of German casualties in the Western theater shows that artillery and mortar fire caused between 60 and 65% of all combat deaths and wounds. This percentage exceeded artillery's contribution to casualties in any previous conflict, reflecting both the intensity of American fire and its effectiveness. German soldiers in other theaters faced dangerous enemies, but nowhere else did they experience the combination of quantity, quality, and tactical sophistication that characterized American artillery operations. The legacy of American artillery superiority in World War II influenced military doctrine for decades afterward. American faith in firepower as a means of reducing friendly casualties while overwhelming enemies became a cornerstone of Cold War military planning. The Soviet Union, having observed American capabilities during their brief period as co-belligerents against Germany, invested heavily in artillery development to ensure they would never face a similar disadvantage. The age of precision-guided munitions and smart weapons still lay decades in the future, but the fundamental lesson had been established. Superior artillery, properly employed, could be the decisive factor in modern warfare. For the German soldiers who survived the war, memories of American artillery remained vivid. In memoirs, interviews, and veterans' accounts recorded in subsequent decades, they consistently described artillery fire as their most traumatic experience. Elderly men who had fought in some of the 20th century's most intense battles would still flinch at sudden loud noises, still dream of the whistle of incoming shells, still remember the helpless terror of crouching in inadequate cover while the ground heaved and explosions merged into continuous roar. The thunder of American guns had followed them home from the war and would never entirely fall silent. The Americans who served those guns returned home with different memories, of machines that worked reliably, of ammunition that never ran short, of missions accomplished and targets destroyed. They had manned the artillery that broke the German army's ability to fight, that supported infantry advances with overwhelming fire, that proved decisive in history's greatest conflict. Their contribution had been essential to Allied victory, purchased at relatively low cost in American lives compared to the casualties that would have resulted from less effective fire support. When veterans of the artillery gathered in subsequent decades, they spoke of their service with pride and satisfaction. They had been skilled professionals operating at the peak of their craft, and they had prevailed against an enemy that had conquered most of Europe. The guns had spoken, and Germany had no answer to their thunder.